America. That's what we've been learning about all this semester, right? Wrong. Miss Drew has been lying to us. Half of what we've been learning, America wasn't even a country. The United States became its own country in 1776. Before then, we were talking about the Brits. Period 3 runs from about 1750 to the 1800s, and it's all about the revolution, what led up to it, and the aftermath of the revolution, but also how we decided to run a government after becoming independent from Great Britain. So first we'll talk about pre-American Revolution. So as we know, Britain took control of most of the East Coast, while France took control of Canada, the northern part of North America. Both nations were trying to expand. France was trying to expand south, and Britain was trying to expand west. And eventually, they're gonna hit. Now, when we think of war between France and Great Britain, mainly we think of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. But there were a couple important battles that led up to that. Most notably was King William's War and King George's War. King William's War was Britain's attempt to gain Quebec, but that ended up failing. But King George's War, Britain actually did end up capturing Fort Louisbourg, which is a huge fort that France had, but they ended up selling it back to France in order for economic gain in India. What kind of a trade is that? Some colonists weren't really happy with this decision, but we are not nearly to the point of revolution just yet. But the most serious consequences of these wars was tensions rising and ultimately resulting in the 7 Years' War. How long did it last? Can you guys guess? Actually, it lasted 9 years. I don't know why they called it the 7 Years' War. In this war, France became allies with American Indians in order to fight back against Britain. The Indians were mainly fighting to preserve their culture and take back some land that Britain had taken away from them. The war lasted from 1754 to 1763 and ultimately ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. While Great Britain won, there were some consequences, mainly debt. The main gain from this war was a significant amount of land given to Great Britain, although Great Britain did have to give away Cuba in order to take Spanish Florida, which I don't really know if that's a good trade, judging by how many Florida men there are. I mean, come on. But hey, I guess we got Disney. But the downside to the war was Great Britain was in massive debt, and they needed some way to pay back. And the first way they thought of was taxes, everyone's favorite, yeah! The British government tried multiple ways to tax the people without making them mad. But with every tax, people got mad. The first main tax was the Sugar Act. This taxed foreign sugar and certain luxuries. This was enacted in 1764 and was repealed in 1766. Another one was the Stamp Act, which was the first direct tax to the colonists. This required revenue stamps to be placed on most printed paper in the colonies. As sort of revenge, the colonists refused to pay for articles of British origin. This act was imposed on 1765 and repealed in 1766. I think you're noticing a common theme here. Acts were imposed and then quickly repealed. From these taxes, multiple conflicts arose, such as the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Massacre was the result of the Quartering Act, which was basically an act that allowed British soldiers to take shelter in colonist homes. A fight broke out between a couple colonists and a soldier, and then more colonists and soldiers showed up and a massive brawl broke out. As a result of this fight, 5 colonists died. A man named Samuel Adams used this as fuel to fire up some colonists. For the following 2 years of the massacre, Samuel Adams created an organization in which the people would send letters containing sus or threatening activities by Britain. The next big event was the Boston Tea Party. This was coming off yet another tax called the Sugar Act. This made the price of British tea cheaper than smuggled in Dutch tea. Yeah, we're smuggling, all right. We're not gonna bow down to any unruly hooligans. Instead of bowing down, they knocked down the tea crates into the ocean. In retaliation of this inconceivable act by the colonists, the British Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts. This included 4 acts which, among other things, provided for the closing of the Boston port until the money from the tea was paid back, reducing the power of the Massachusetts legislature, the enabling of British soldiers to be quartered in private homes, and other things that the colonists apparently declared intolerable. Okay, let's move away from taxes. There were other problems that arose from the French and Indian War besides money. Even though Britain did gain land from France, we didn't really do much with it because of the Proclamation Line of 1763. This was an act passed by Britain which prevented colonists from expanding west of the Appalachian Mountains. So what was the point of the war, the colonists thought? The problems needed to be discussed, which they were in a meeting called the First Continental Congress. They agreed that the conditions they had were unsatisfactory, but they weren't to the point of asking for independence. Among requests such as the repeal of the Intolerable Acts, the First Continental Congress decided that they would meet again if their conditions were not met. And, well, Britain did not meet those conditions, and they met again in May of 1775. At this point, tensions were rising and colonists were at the brink of war. The king was also very frustrated, and in reaction to the First Continental Congress meeting, the king sent over additional soldiers to Massachusetts, in which the first battle of the Revolution was fought. But if we were going to win this war, we needed a leader. So one person rose to the top and became commander-in-chief. George Washington, baby. Yeah, that guy with the amazing hair. But what is a leader without his army? Not everyone was convinced that the disservice Britain did to America was enough to gain independence. Others were convinced that what Britain had done was enough, so they tried to convince the others who weren't very convinced with writing. Possibly the most well-known piece of writing written during the Revolution had the purpose of convincing people to join the Revolution, and was also written by Thomas Paine, was Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Not many pieces of literature satisfy all those requirements, but it's at the top of it nonetheless. Basically, what Common Sense was arguing was that it was pointless for America to stay with Britain because ultimately Britain was not helping America at all. So it was a necessity to fight this war. War, yada yada yada. America ended up winning the war and passed the Declaration of Independence, declaring America as a separate country. But whoop-de-doo, you can't just let colonists run around. There has to be some structure. But making a new government is easier said than done. Colonists didn't exactly trust the government anymore. So to start, the Founding Fathers passed the Articles of Confederation, which ended up being pretty weak. It gave a lot of the power to the states and not a lot of power to the federal government. But isn't this what the colonists wanted? Yeah, but not every idea is great. But nonetheless, this was a huge step in US history. It made the Founding Fathers realize what the government needed. So the Founding Fathers ended up drafting the Constitution, which is now being used even today. The main differences between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution is that 1. It created the 3 branches of government, the legislative, executive, and the judicial branch. It also gave the government more power over money, giving them the power to tax, and most importantly, declared the Constitution as a law of the land. This gave the government a lot more power, which a lot of people did not trust. So to convince more people, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison wrote under the name Publius, which, fun fact, Publius means of the people, wrote the Federalist Papers. All of these papers wrote in favor of passing the Constitution. This was communicated through 85 essays, which, if you did not know, is 84 more essays than I would have liked. I feel like he could have gotten his point across with just a few of the documents. In my opinion, the most important ones were Federalist 10, Federalist 51, 70, and 78, because these 4 documents got the most important points across, that being the importance of the Constitution to limit the power of factions, the idea of checks and balances, why there should only be one president, and the process of judicial review. Interestingly, judicial review wasn't even established until period 4. Upon taking office, Jefferson wanted to block the Federalist judges appointed by his predecessor, President John Adams. One of Adams' quote-unquote midnight appointments, William Marbury, sued for his commission. Marshall ruled that Marbury had a right to his commission according to the Judiciary Act passed by Congress in 1789. However, Marshall said that the Judiciary Act of 1789 had given to the court greater power than the Constitution allowed. So basically, the Supreme Court found a law that was unconstitutional, with which the Supreme Court created its own power of judicial review to declare the law void. But anyway, not everyone was convinced even with these Federalist Papers, and the most outspoken of these people was Robert Yates, who wrote under the name Brutus and wrote Brutus number 1. He expressed the concern in this article that the government described by the Constitution would not be able to represent such a large republic and ultimately gives too much power to the federal government. In order to convince all 13 states to ratify the Constitution, multiple compromises were made, which we all know how good we are at compromises. The three main compromises was the Great Compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and the Electoral College. First, the Great Compromise created the two branches of the legislative branch, the House of Representatives and the Senate. All states would have the same number of senators, but the number of representatives in the House would be determined by the population of each state. The more people in a state, the more representatives they get in House. This was a compromise between small states who wanted equal representation and large states who wanted to have higher representation because they had more people. Next, the Three-Fifths Compromise was created between slave states and non-slave states. Slave states wanted slaves to count as a full person when designating representatives to each state, which was kind of ironic because they kind of treated slaves not as humans. And non-slave states did not want slaves to count when designating representatives. So a compromise was made to make slaves count as 3/5 of a person, which is like possibly the most demeaning thing you can do. And also, why did they decide on 3/5 and not like 1/2 or something? I don't know. We're weird. Anyway, moving on to the Electoral College. Voting for the president was a big problem. Who would decide who the president was? Some people did not want it to be based solely on the popular vote because then minorities would not be represented. So the Electoral College was created, in which electors would vote for the president, which most of the people in the state that the elector is representing voted for. The number of electors each state had was determined by how many representatives each state had. So the amount of senators and the amount of people in the House that each state has added together. Whoever would win the most electoral votes, regardless of the popular vote, would win the election. People were still not convinced to pass the Constitution because at the end of the day, the Constitution didn't guarantee any rights to citizens, which the citizens were obviously worried about. Anti-Federalists wanted the Bill of Rights to be passed to guarantee these rights to citizens, but the Federalists thought this was redundant and didn't want to pass the Bill of Rights. But the Bill of Rights ended up being passed in 1788, which were the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. So overall, the Constitution was drafted in 1776, all 13 states ratified it in 1788, and it was passed into law in 1789. The first members of Congress were elected in 1788, along with the Electoral College unanimously selecting George Washington as the first president of the United States. Being the first president, he needed to set a good example for presidents to come and prove that the Constitution was going to work. In his farewell address, he asked future presidents to follow some certain rules, to not get involved in European affairs, not making permanent alliances in foreign affairs, not forming political alliances, and not falling into sectionalism. We ended up breaking these precedents at different points of time in history, but perhaps the most important precedent that he set was the 2-term limit. He voluntarily did not run for a third term after his second term, setting the precedent that presidents would only run for 2 terms. Only one president would go on to not follow this precedent, who was Franklin D. Roosevelt. After he broke this precedent, a law ended up being passed that set the 2-term limit for good. The next president was John Adams. John Adams was a Federalist like Washington. However, he made controversial decisions that led to the Federalist Party losing popularity. Perhaps his most infamous act was passing the Alien and Sedition Acts. This allowed the president to deport aliens and made it so that newspapers could not trash on the president. This led to the first non-Federalist president, Thomas Jefferson, who was a Democratic Republican, being elected into office. This was the first major shift in political power in the office, and it ended up being peaceful, which proved that the Constitution was working. And that's about it for period 3. But don't think you're off the hook. I've got some questions to ask you to make sure you weren't sleeping in class. What were the two main wars that led up to the French and Indian War? If you guessed B, you are correct. What was the first tax to tax the colonists directly? Did you get that one? A? Hopefully you did. True or false? The 7 Years' War lasted 7 years. Seems obvious, right? Haha, almost got you. What compromise created the bicameral legislature? D. The Great Compromise. What did the pen name of the writers of the Federalist Papers, Publius, mean? That was a tricky one. Who wanted the Bill of Rights? Really hoping you got that one. What led to the Federalists losing popularity? A lot of writing on these questions. A. John Adams, everyone's favorite. Thank you for watching. Wait, guys, I'm not done the presentation. I'm sorry, but Mr. Drew told me that I missed a part of the rubric, and I've got to do it. I'm sorry, this is all Mr. Drew's fault. Don't blame me. I totally didn't forget to scroll down in the document. Let me just push all of this out of the way. Coming in at number 3 is American and national identity. We were fighting against Britain for multiple reasons, such as the ideas from common sense which said Britain was basically useless to America, but also the idea of democracy. The common saying back then was no taxation without representation. And basically what they were saying is that they wanted democracy. They wanted to be part of the process when implementing things such as taxes. They also wanted to establish certain unalienable rights. Although it is important that we were fighting for things such as democracy, we ultimately didn't really establish a strong national identity. I mean, most of the people did not experience the things that we were fighting for. So coming in at number 2, there's politics and power. We didn't have a government before the revolution, but I would describe the First and Second Continental Congress as falling under the politics category. I mean, technically it is a government. They were discussing problems that ultimately needed to be fixed. But where this theme really shines is after the revolution, where we decide how to run our country. We established the Articles of Confederation, which ultimately failed, but it ended up creating the Constitution because we realized what we needed in order to run a country. There was also the first debates of this country, the most notable one being the one about the Bill of Rights. Should the Bill of Rights be established or not? But coming in at number 1 is culture and society. Now number 1 and 2 can really be switched depending on your perspective of things. I'm saying that culture and society was ultimately more important than politics and power because the ideas are ultimately what led up to the revolution and put us in a position to actually create a government. But also an argument can be made that the actual execution of making a government was ultimately more important because at the end of the day, the founding fathers were way ahead of their time in creating the Constitution, which we still use 2 centuries later. But in my opinion, if we didn't have these ideas, would we even separate from Britain? And ultimately, would we have a government? Maybe a little while after, but for the revolution to happen as soon as it did, we ultimately needed those ideas to be brewing and ultimately inspiring the revolution. Pretty sure I just nailed the complexity point. Oh, I forgot to write it on the board. The biggest idea brewing before the revolution was unalienable rights, which I did briefly mention in American and national identity, but it mainly falls into culture and society. When you think about it, unalienable rights were important in all of period 3. From when the colonists discovered that these rights were being infringed upon by Britain, to one of the main reasons that America asked for independence from Great Britain, as mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, and finally the inspiration behind creating the Bill of Rights, which would guarantee these rights. Unalienable rights truly represents the whole idea behind why America was created. I think that's good.